This, yes? It didn't repeal it, but it was going to open up slavery above the 3630 line. But still, where we already had the 3630 line, it still was illegal north of there and south of there, like, and not in that territory, though. Does that make sense? Okay. Alrighty, this is page 3. So, post-Civil War and Reconstruction. How does the Civil War and Reconstruction impact women and African Americans? Okay? So, first off, women. They renew their fight for the right to vote, or for suffrage. Why do they renew their fight for suffrage after the Civil War?
Because the black males got the right to vote, and then they thought it was unfair because like they tried to make it so that women could be in it, but they got it.
Yes, exactly. African American men get the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, and women are still denied the right to vote. So remember, abolitionism really overshadows the women's movement and temperance in the mid-1800s, but it reignites it afterwards because African American men get the right to vote, women do not. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are still around post-Civil War. Susan B. Anthony will actually be arrested for voting in New York, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, Susan B. Anthony versus the U.S., and she lost the case. This is also when they officially create a organization. It was called NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and it's created by Anthony and Stanton. Now, as a result of the Civil War and Reconstruction, you have the end of slavery. Okay, during the Civil War, what document committed the government to ending slavery? Emancipation Proclamation. Make sure you understand, it only freed the slaves in the rebelling territories. It did not free the slaves in the border state. So technically, it did not free a single slave. Although many slaves will flee the plantations and find the Union Army down in the South. Okay. But what's important about the Emancipation Proclamation is it basically committed the government to ending slavery if they won the war, which was never clear at the start of the war. If that's what, this was even what we were fighting for. Okay, so it gives the war a purpose. The 13th Amendment then did what? Ended slavery. What did the 14th Amendment do? It made them African American citizens. And what did the 15th Amendment do then? Gave African American men the right to vote. Now, a little bit about Reconstruction here. Okay. After the Civil War, there were two different points of view about how to deal with Reconstruction and allowing the South back into the country. Okay. There was Lincoln's 10% plan. And tell me a little bit about his plan. Was it nice or mean? Nice. It was nicer, okay? The official name of it was the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. So basically, it forgave the South and made it pretty easy for states to re-enter the Union. And why did Lincoln make it that way? Riley?
He wants the Union to be nice together.
Yeah, like we're never going to get past the Civil War and everything unless we try to forgive and move past this, okay? Johnson's plan was pretty similar. It was a little harsher to the South, but not much, okay? Then you had the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which ends up being the Reconstruction Plan, okay? And it's adopted by what were referred to as the Radical Republicans in Congress.
What was that act called?
The Reconstruction Act of 1867. Is it on the paper? And this plan was a lot harsher on the South. It made it harder for the South to re-enter. It also divided the South into military districts, and those districts are occupied by the Federal Army. Okay. So what went on here after the Civil War was really a fight between Congress and the President for who has the power of Reconstruction. And of course, it doesn't say anything about that in our Constitution. So it was the Congress that ultimately wins out. Okay? And of course, the radical Republicans even try to impeach Andrew Johnson when he gets in the way of their Reconstruction plans, but he's never removed from office. Now, when, you might want to put in the margin here, when Reconstruction is going on until 1877, because the federal government is occupying the South, African Americans were seeing, were getting to vote, they were getting elected to public office in a limited way, but they were getting some protections to their rights. Once Reconstruction ends in 1877 and the Federal Army leaves, things go really bad for African Americans. Okay? Because what does the South start to put in place immediately after the war? What are some of the things? Huh? Jim Crow laws, yep. And what are those? What are Jim Crow laws? Yes, they are the laws that segregate blacks and whites. There were also black codes. Those basically required that you had to carry work papers to prove where you worked. You also could not rent property, homes, or borrow money to buy land. So essentially, the black codes were still keeping slaves in a slave-like status. You couldn't rent like a home or land or buy land because you couldn't borrow money. Then most African Americans had to end up sharecropping, and poor whites. And what is sharecropping? Mm-hmm.
It's when you rent land and you give a percentage of your crops to.
Very good. Yeah, you are given space on a large plantation to farm, but you have to pay money to the plantation owner to do that. You also have to buy all your supplies. And then they get a percentage of your crop. Okay? But if you have a bad crop, you can't pay your rent, you can't pay for the supplies, then you end up in debt to the plantation owner, and you end up like permanently stuck on this plantation. So it almost like replaces slavery. You also had the formation of the KKK, which used fear and intimidation to limit African Americans' rights. And then the Supreme Court upheld Jim Crow laws in Plessy versus Ferguson. And that they basically said it's okay for facilities to be separate as long as they're equal. Okay. All right, we move into the Progressive Era, and this really starts in response to industrialization, the Second Industrial Era, and really begins around the turn of the century and goes until World War I. So, key reformers. Again, it's going to be led by women, especially middle-class women. Jane Addams, what did she do? Hull House, which was a settlement house where they put middle-class women to live in the inner city to provide services to poor and immigrants. Anybody know what Frances Willard was associated with? What movement? The Women's Christian Temperance Union. So she was part of Temperance, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Florence Kelly worked to end the poor conditions for children in factories and end child labor. The temperance movement. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was her organization, Temperance. Mother Jones, she worked to try to end child labor. She was also a leader in temperance as well. And then who was Ida Tarbell? Not Ida B. Wells, Ida Tarbell. She was a muckraker. And what did she expose? Oil, Standard Oil, and the monopoly. Okay, now, African Americans are also going to start to push for better equality. However, almost all the progressive reformers ignore African Americans. Guys, you need to quiet down so I don't have to yell. Why were African American causes pretty much ignored by progressive reformers? What did they fear?
Oh, that they would be giving up white supremacy.
that they would lose the support of the South. So that's why the progressive presidents, the progressive reformers, including like the leading women for women's suffrage, pretty much ignored the African Americans because they didn't want to lose Southern support. So African Americans are going to be advocating for themselves. You had W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington at this time. They had very different viewpoints on equality. How did W.E.B. Du Bois feel about equality?
You want it right down there?
Yeah, he wanted immediate social and political equality. Immediate social and political equality. And what was the key to getting that equality? What type of education? Higher education, college. Okay. What was Booker T. Washington's perspective? More gradual, more gradual equality. And he believed economic equality was the key. So what type of education was he promoting for African Americans? Yeah, one profession and vocational school. Like, let's get the type of jobs that whites would like to see us in, so we can start to build some economic equality. It's during this time, the early 1900s, that Du Bois founded the NAACP as part of the Niagara movement. And the NAACP, its goal is going to be to train African American attorneys to take cases of discrimination to court. And eventually they get a ruling in their favor. All right, also during the Progressive Era is where we see the women's suffrage movement really kick it into gear. You had two women. Guys, we have to move fast if you want to get done by 3:15, so don't talk when you turn the page. Carrie Chapman Catt is going to be the leader of Nassau since Stanton and Anthony are no longer around. And then you have the more radical group, the National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul. How did they differ from each other? Anybody? All right, I'll just tell you. All right, this is an area I'm feeling like you guys are really, really, really weak, is the Progressive Era. And I know that's when there were a lot of snow days, so this is an area you really got to go back and hit hard, okay? Catt was pushing for a state-by-state campaign. So we'll get each state to change their voting laws to allow women to vote, okay? Which states were doing at this time. There were most Western states women could vote. And they did not want any radical protesting. Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, on the other hand, they were pushing for just a straight-up constitutional amendment. They said the state-by-state campaign will take forever. They were much more radical in their protesting. Okay, this is the group that's going to have parades. They picket the White House even when World War I began. And Alice Paul leads hunger strikes in prison. So the 19th Amendment is what eventually gave women the right to vote. It was eventually ratified by all the states in 1920. And Wilson asked for Congress to pass it during World War I because he said, we need to do this since the women are helping in the war effort. Really, it was because it made him look like a hypocrite to be denying women the right to vote when we're fighting for democracy. All right, so into World War I in the 1920s. What was the role of women in that war? They went to work, but only about 200,000 went to work, okay? And that World War I is going to be followed by the 1920s, which was a time of social liberation for women, led by the flappers, who are really a very small group in society, but they're going to influence style and so forth. So what are some characteristics of the flappers? How are women socially liberated? Yeah, drinking, smoking in public. Yes, shorter dresses, short hair instead of the tight bun, bobbed hair. Going on dates. Okay. So socially, things really changed for women. Okay. The other things that contribute besides the flapper are the new woman that emerges during the industrial era, that like single women can get jobs being secretaries and sales clerks, giving them some economic power. Movie stars in the silent movies. How were they not liberated in the 1920s? Were they getting more jobs, equal pay? No. Were they getting higher education? No. Were they getting any political power? No. It was not a politically or economically liberating time necessarily for women. All right, African Americans, of course, the Great Migration occurs during the war. And what is that migration? Where are they moving from and to and why? From the south to the north for jobs. What does that lead to in the 1920s? Okay, it leads to race riots in the north because we're going to see racial tension move north. What else does it contribute to in the 1920s? Jazz Age, Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro Movement, and eventually civil rights. We've just talked about that though. All right. The impact of the Great Depression. Okay. What were some problems faced by women and African Americans during the Great Depression? Anybody remember any problems faced by women and African Americans? Yep.
Well, I know African Americans had a higher unemployment rate.
Yes, both of them had higher unemployment rates. And the New Deal did not help women and African Americans as much as it helped white men. However, you do see some steps in the right direction. For example, Frances Perkins became our first woman cabinet member ever. She headed up the Department of Labor. And FDR also had the Black Cabinet, which was a group of African American advisors. The Black Cabinet. FDR, because he was president during this. And then Eleanor Roosevelt will play a key role in her husband's administration. She's really the one who pushes for programs that help women and help African Americans.